The darkness of space loomed heavy over the Sol system as an uncountable number of warships moved into formation, their towering hulls blocking out the distant stars. The XL-Thar Dominion, a species known for their relentless conquest and utter destruction of weaker civilizations, had arrived at humanity's doorstep. They had crushed empires that had stood for thousands of years, leaving only ruins in their wake. Now, Earth was their next target, and to them, this was nothing more than routine. From their perspective, humanity was a young, arrogant species, barely a blip on the galactic stage. The Galactic Council had already washed its hands of the matter, declaring that Earth was doomed. No one expected the humans to stand a chance. And yet, something was different. The usual desperation, the frantic pleas for mercy, none of it came. Instead, the humans remained eerily silent. The XL-Thar High Command watched from their colossal flagship, the Tyrant's Will, as their fleet moved past the icy rings of Saturn. Thousands of warships, armed with planet-killer weapons, slowly advanced toward Earth, their sensors scanning for any resistance. What little human fleet remained was laughable tiny ships, outmatched in both size and technology. Some of the XL-Thar officers even found it amusing that Earth hadn't surrendered yet. They had crushed mightier foes who had at least begged before their destruction. But here, silence, arrogance, or perhaps something else? It was then that Supreme Commander Vorthon, a veteran of countless planetary invasions, felt something he had never felt before, an unease deep in his gut. It was absurd. He had led campaigns where billions had perished, and never once had he doubted victory. Yet, as his fleet moved deeper into the system, that feeling grew. Something was wrong. The XL-Thar fleet's powerful scanners swept across the planets and moons, searching for hidden bases or traps, but they found nothing out of the ordinary. Mars had military outposts, but they were insignificant compared to the Dominion's forces. Titan had some human activity, though nothing that posed a threat. Earth's orbital defenses were shockingly weak, outdated railguns and missile silos that would barely scratch the XL-Thar warships. And yet, humanity refused to communicate. No distress calls, no surrender messages, just silence. Then, the first anomaly occurred. It started with a single warship near Jupiter. A minor vessel, nothing special, but within a blink, it was simply gone. No explosion, no debris, no sign of an attack. One moment it was there, and the next it had vanished from existence. Confused, the fleet's engineers scrambled for answers, believing it to be a malfunction. But before they could finish their analysis, another ship disappeared. And another. Panic began to ripple through the XL-Thar ranks. Warships were not destroyed. Destruction would have at least left something behind. But here, it was as if space itself was swallowing them whole. Then came the distortions. Time and gravity fluctuated around them, readings shifting in impossible ways. Some XL-Thar ships reported seeing echoes of their own fleet appearing and disappearing ahead of them, as if space was folding in on itself. Others lost all sense of direction, their navigation systems spinning wildly, showing them in multiple locations at once. Commander Vorthon barked orders, demanding that the fleet regroup, but his words were barely heard over the increasing chaos. Pilots screamed that they were seeing impossible things outside their windows, stars shifting positions, planets appearing to stretch and bend. Weapons officers attempted to lock onto targets, but their targeting systems displayed bizarre readings, showing enemy ships where none existed. It was madness, and the worst part? There was no enemy to fight, no battle to be won. Space itself was turning against them. Then, for the first time since their arrival, a message from Earth was received. It was short, simple, and chilling. You should have left us alone. A deep, paralyzing fear settled over the XL-Thar. They had come expecting resistance. They had prepared for war. But they had not prepared for this. The very laws of the universe were no longer behaving as they should, and the fleet that had once been the unstoppable force of the galaxy now felt like helpless prey. Vorthon, his mind racing, demanded a full retreat. It was a direct violation of Dominion protocol. Never before had they fled from an invasion. But this was no ordinary battle. Something beyond their understanding was happening here. Something that could not be fought with weapons or strategy. But as the fleet attempted to turn back, they discovered the most horrifying truth of all. They were already trapped. Panic spread like wildfire through the HFY fleet as their warships struggled against the unseen force gripping them. The mightiest armada in the galaxy, one that had reduced countless civilizations to dust, was now trapped in a silent, invisible battlefield. The stars themselves seemed wrong, their positions shifting unpredictably. Some warships reported their own reflections in the void, as if they were staring at versions of themselves from a different reality. Others found their systems flooded with corrupted data, showing impossible readings, planets appearing where none should exist, ships registering in multiple locations at once, and gravitational forces behaving like a storm with no center. Supreme Commander Vorthan watched in disbelief as another warship, nearly the size of a city, flickered out of existence without a trace. It hadn't been attacked. It hadn't been destroyed. It was just gone. The fleet's top scientists attempted to explain the anomalies, but their words held no comfort. Space itself was twisting. Time was bending. Even the fundamental laws of reality were no longer obeying logic. Vorthan clenched his mandibles in frustration as he demanded answers. Are we under attack? Is this some kind of human trick? But the answers he received only deepened his horror. There is no enemy, his chief strategist whispered. There is no fleet attacking us. There is no energy signature, no ships, no projectiles. This is something else. Another warship screamed through the comms before cutting to static. And then another. A dreadnought, one of the most powerful ships in the Dominion's fleet, began spinning uncontrollably, as if caught in the pull of an invisible whirlpool. Its crew sent desperate distress calls, but nothing could be done. It twisted and warped, stretching impossibly before vanishing into the darkness. No explosion. No debris. Just silence. The remaining fleet, once disciplined and confident, was now in chaos. Pilots shouted conflicting reports. Some claimed they saw Earth in the distance, impossibly close, as if the planet had moved. Others saw their own fleet multiplied across the void, as if reality was splitting into fragments. Some ships lost contact entirely, their signals either delayed or repeating the same few seconds on loop. It was as if space itself was no longer stable. Then the voice returned. The same calm, human voice that had spoken once before. You should have left us alone. This time, it was different. This time, it carried an edge, a weight that made even the battle-hardened HFY warriors shudder. The humans were not pleading. They were not bargaining. They were not fighting in the way the HFY had expected. They had done something far worse. They had broken the rules of war itself. A transmission came from one of the few remaining warships still functional. Supreme Commander, we have found the source of the anomaly. It is coming from Titan. Vorthan narrowed his eyes. Titan? A frozen moon of Saturn? That could not be right. The humans had outposts there, but nothing powerful enough to challenge a fleet of this magnitude. And yet, there was no denying the truth. Something on Titan was the origin of this nightmare. Fire on it, Vorthan ordered, his voice colder than ever. If this was the source of their suffering, it would be destroyed. His fleet still had thousands of warships. They would annihilate the human moonbase, wipe it from existence, and whatever trick the humans were using would end. He refused to believe otherwise. The HFY dreadnoughts charged their primary weapons, the kind that had cracked planets in half. Gigantic plasma beams roared through the void, aimed directly at Titan. The fleet watched, waiting for the satisfying destruction of the moon that had dared to defy them. But as the beams traveled, something impossible happened. The weapons never reached their target. The energy twisted mid-flight, spiraling into an invisible force, as if space itself had swallowed the attack whole. Some beams were redirected entirely, vanishing into nothingness, while others bent backward, looping into the void like a snake eating its own tail. One unlucky XL-their warship, positioned too close, was struck by its own redirected attack and exploded instantly. The fleet watched in stunned horror as their most powerful weapons were made meaningless. And then, the nightmare deepened. Titan was changing. A ripple of energy pulsed outward from the moon's surface, distorting everything it touched. The void twisted. Space buckled. The XL-Thar fleet, already in chaos, was now truly helpless. Warships found themselves dragged into gravitational spirals that had not existed moments before. Some were stretched thin, pulled apart, as if the very fabric of reality had turned against them. Others were thrown light years away in an instant, lost to the unknown. A few unfortunate ones began looping through time itself, stuck in repeating moments, screaming endlessly into their own fractured past. The truth settled in. Humanity had not built a weapon in the traditional sense. They had not designed lasers, missiles, or planetary cannons. No, what they had created was far more terrifying. They had learned to manipulate the very nature of space-time itself. Project Phantom Singularity was not an attack. It was not a defense. It was a disruption, a controlled distortion of reality that only humanity understood. To the XL-Thar, this was an abomination, an impossibility, something that should not exist. And yet, it did. It was their punishment for believing humanity was weak. It was their doom. For the first time in recorded history, the XLR Dominion faced something they could not conquer. The strongest armada in the galaxy was being erased not by an enemy fleet, not by a superior weapon, but by the very universe rebelling against them. There was no counterattack. There was no escape. And the last thing the XL-Thar heard before their fleet was swallowed by the abyss was humanity's final warning. This is what happens when you try to take what is not yours. The XL-Thar Dominion had fought countless wars across the galaxy, had shattered entire civilizations beneath the might of their armadas, and had crushed the wills of species who thought themselves unbreakable. But now, as their once glorious fleet was torn apart by an invisible force, they faced something far worse than war. This was not a battle. It was annihilation. It was an unraveling of everything they knew, and the worst part was that they still did not understand what was happening. Space itself was betraying them. Their warships, massive behemoths, built to withstand planetary bombardments, were vanishing one by one, not in explosions, not in destruction, but in complete erasure. No debris, no wreckage, nothing left behind. One moment, they existed. The next, they were gone, as if they had never been there at all. The commanders screamed into their comms, demanding answers, but there were none. Every calculation, every attempt to make sense of the anomaly, failed. And Titan, that frozen, unimportant moon, remained at the center of it all. Supreme Commander Vorthon clenched his mandibles as he tried to maintain control over his fleet. His flagship, the Tyrant's Will, was one of the few still intact, but for how long? Every moment, more ships disappeared, pulled into the abyss of the unknown. His officers reported impossible readings. Some claimed they were receiving distress signals from their own ships that had already vanished, as if echoes of the past were trying to reach them. Others swore they saw their own fleet ahead of them, moving in perfect synchronization, as if they were caught in a loop of time. The horror of it all was that nothing could be stopped. There was no enemy to shoot, no defenses to raise, no retreat to make. Wherever the XL-Thar fleet tried to move, space shifted around them, bending in ways that made no sense. What was once forward now led backward. What was once open space now led into a void that devoured anything that entered. A deep, guttural fear spread through the XL-Thar warriors. They were a species bred for war, unshaken by the destruction of planets. But this was different. This was not war. This was something else entirely. And then, a voice. You were warned. The human voice echoed through every communication channel at once. It was calm, almost emotionless, yet it carried a weight that made even the bravest XL-Thar tremble. There was no rage in it, no hatred, only a certainty, an inevitability that sent pure dread through the Dominion's forces. Vorthan's claws dug into the control panel as he growled, "Enough of this madness! If we cannot fight this weapon, then we must flee. Order all remaining ships to retreat beyond the system." But the moment he gave the order, reality itself shattered. The stars, once distant and unmoving, began to spiral. Entire planets stretched and distorted as if made of liquid. Time fractured. Some ships attempted to flee, only to find themselves appearing right back where they had started, their engines burning in futility. Others found themselves dragged toward a point in space where no object existed, only a silent, endless blackness that consumed anything that came too close. And then the real horror began. The ships that had disappeared came back, but they were not as they were before. They flickered into existence, their hulls twisted, their structures impossibly warped. The screams of their crews echoed through the comms, voices distorted, stretched, as if they were speaking from across multiple dimensions at once. Some ships returned already broken apart, their pieces floating lifelessly, with no trace of what had happened to them. Others came back alive, but the things inside them were no longer Exeldar. They moved wrong. They spoke in broken fragments, repeating words that had no meaning. One ship, the Wrath of Corinne, hailed the flagship, its captain's voice a garbled whisper, "We left. But we are still here. We are still here. We are still here." Then, silence. The ship folded inward, vanishing once again, never to be seen again. Vorthan's mind screamed for reason, for logic, but there was none. What humanity had created was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was something worse. It was a manipulation of the universe itself. A trap in space-time that ensnared anything that entered. A phantom singularity that twisted reality beyond recognition. This was not a battle they had lost. It was an execution. The Exeldar Dominion, in all its arrogance, had assumed humanity to be weak. They had seen Earth as a minor species, one that would either submit or be destroyed. They had never considered that humans could create something beyond their understanding. And now, they were paying the price. The last of the Exeldar fleet, what little remained of it, tried desperately to hold position, but even the strongest dreadnoughts were beginning to warp. They no longer moved with their own power. They drifted, dragged toward an invisible force at the heart of the anomaly. Vorthan watched, helpless, as his warriors screamed for salvation, but none would come. His own ship's structure groaned as the very metal began to stretch unnaturally. Looking out the viewport, he saw something that shattered what little remained of his sanity. Earth.it was there, closer than it should have been, and yet impossibly far away. It was as if he was seeing it from every possible point in space at once. The planet shimmered, flickering between distances, and then without warning, the horror of the singularity reached its final stage. The blackness at the center of the anomaly expanded, pulling in everything like an unseen tide. Ships, debris, time itself, it all collapsed inward. And in his last moments, Vorthan finally understood the truth. Humanity had won this war before it had even begun. The flagship Tyrant's will was pulled into the endless abyss. Vorthan let out one final, silent scream. But no one would ever hear it. The Exeldar Dominion was no more. The Exeldar Dominion, once the most feared force in the galaxy, had ruled through war, crushing any opposition without mercy. They had believed themselves untouchable, their fleets invincible, their dominion eternal. But now, all that remained of their might was silence. The great armada that had ventured to conquer the humans had vanished into the abyss. Consumed by the terrifying force, humanity had unleashed the phantom singularity. At first, the Dominion's High Council refused to believe it. How could an entire fleet simply disappear? There had to be a mistake. Yet, no transmissions came. No ships returned. Every scout sent to investigate never made it back. The system where the battle had taken place had become a dead zone, an empty void where time and space no longer followed any natural law. What the humans had created was not a battlefield, but a graveyard of reality itself. Panic spread across the Dominion like wildfire. The once unshakable rulers of 1,000 worlds found themselves paralyzed with fear. The humans, a species they had once considered weak, had done the impossible. They had not only defeated the Dominion's strongest fleet, but had erased it from existence. The implications were horrifying. If humanity could wield such a weapon, then no world was safe. No fortress was secure. No fleet, no matter how vast, could stand against something that defied the very fabric of the universe. The realization shattered the arrogance of the Exelthar. For the first time in their history, they were not the hunters. They were the prey. Desperation gripped the High Council. They convened in secret, their towering forms trembling as they debated their next move. Some called for immediate retaliation. We must strike before they use this weapon again. Others shouted, but how? The fleet that had attacked Earth had been the strongest the Dominion had ever assembled. If that had failed, what chance did they have now? More cautious voices spoke of retreat. We must negotiate. Offer peace before they turn this weapon against our homeworlds. But the idea of surrender was unthinkable. The Dominion had never bowed to any species. To do so now would mean admitting that their rule was over. And then the final blow came. A message broadcasted across the Dominion's entire network. It was simple. Cold. Final. The war is over. Do not test us again. Humanity had spoken. They had not demanded surrender. They had not offered conditions. They had simply declared the war finished. And that was the true horror of it. Humanity no longer saw the Dominion as a threat. They did not ask for territory nor for tribute. They simply left the Dominion to its fate, knowing that fear alone would be enough to tear it apart. And it did. The news spread to the farthest corners of the Empire. The once loyal warlords, who had ruled under the Dominion's banner for generations, saw weakness. If the Great Fleet could be erased so effortlessly, then the Dominion was no longer the supreme power it claimed to be. Rebellions erupted overnight. Worlds that had lived in submission for centuries suddenly realized that the Exelthar could be defeated. And if humanity would not strike their homeworlds, then their own subjects would. One by one, the Dominion's territories fell into chaos. Civil wars broke out as former allies turned on each other, each faction trying to seize power in the void left by their failing empire. The great war machine that had once conquered the stars was now turning against itself. The High Council tried to maintain control, issuing desperate orders, calling for unity, but it was useless. Fear had done what no enemy fleet had ever achieved. It had shattered the Exelthar from within. Some of the highest-ranking commanders vanished, fleeing into the unknown, seeking refuge in distant, uncharted systems. Others turned on their own people, using their remaining forces to carve out personal kingdoms from the ruins of the Dominion. And through it all, humanity remained silent. They did not invade. They did not strike again. They simply watched as the empire that had once sought to enslave them collapsed under its own weight. The Exelthar homeworld, once the heart of the most powerful empire in the galaxy, became a world of whispers and shadows. No ships arrived, no orders were obeyed. The streets of its towering cities, once filled with the sounds of marching soldiers and the hum of war machines, now echoed only with uncertainty. The Dominion was finished, not by battle, not by invasion, but by something far worse, the knowledge that they had been defeated by something they could never understand, could never fight, could never escape. And on Earth, humanity watched the stars, knowing that the greatest war in history had ended without them ever having to fire a single shot beyond their own system. The Exelthar had doomed themselves the moment they had underestimated humanity. The lesson had been taught. And now, the galaxy would never forget. The fall of the Exelthar Dominion sent ripples across the galaxy. Once, their empire had been the symbol of absolute power, feared and respected by every species. Now, it was nothing but a fractured memory, torn apart by its own fear, paranoia, and the impossible force that humanity had unleashed. The Great War had ended, but the galaxy had not returned to peace. Instead, it stood at the edge of uncertainty, a void left behind by the collapse of its most dominant force. Warlords, rebels, and opportunists fought for control of former Dominion territories, turning entire sectors into battlefields where no law remained. And through it all, one question echoed across the stars: who would take their place? Many had expected humanity to rise as the new rulers of the galaxy. After all, they had single-handedly destroyed the most powerful armada ever assembled without losing a single warship. They had shown a level of technological mastery that defied comprehension, bending the very fabric of space and time to their will. If any species had the right to claim dominance, it was them. But humanity did not move. Their fleets remained within their own borders, their warships silent. No conquerors came marching from Earth, no demands were made. Instead, they watched, waited, and the galaxy grew uneasy. The surviving species gathered in secret, desperate to understand what humanity's next move would be. Would they seize the broken remains of the Dominion, carving their own empire from the ruins? Would they strike down any who opposed them, proving their supremacy beyond question? Or would they do something even worse, simply remain silent, their presence alone enough to keep the galaxy in check? No one knew, and that uncertainty was more terrifying than any invasion. But even without direct action, the influence of humanity had already begun reshaping the galaxy. The collapse of the Dominion had created a power vacuum, and into that void, new alliances and rivalries emerged. The Yveth Consortium, once traitors bound by Dominion rule, expanded aggressively, using their wealth to buy entire systems, turning former war zones into economic strongholds. The Voronoi clans, once scattered nomads, saw an opportunity to claim their first homeworld in centuries, their warriors fighting to secure planets abandoned by the Dominion. The Karthak swarm, a species long held in check by the Dominion's iron fist, unleashed their hunger upon the lawless regions, consuming everything in their path. And yet, despite all the chaos, none dared to touch human space. There was an unspoken rule among the remnants of the Dominion and the rising factions: Earth was not to be threatened. The horror of what had happened to the Exelthar fleet was still fresh in everyone's mind. No one wished to test humanity's patience. It was not out of respect, nor diplomacy, but sheer, primal terror. Even the most aggressive warlords understood that one wrong move could awaken the force that had erased the Dominion's greatest fleet from existence. Humanity had no need to conquer. Their presence alone was enough to ensure order. But Earth was not idle. While the galaxy watched them in fear, humanity worked in silence. Their ships, once hidden within the safety of their own system, were now appearing in distant sectors, not as invaders, but as silent observers. Probes slipped into war-torn regions, gathering information. Small fleets, their weapons inactive, positioned themselves near key trade routes, not enforcing rules, but ensuring stability. It was subtle but undeniable. Without firing a single shot, humanity was already reshaping the galaxy. And then, the message came. It was not a declaration of war, nor an announcement of conquest. Instead, it was a single transmission sent to every major power, every surviving world, every warlord and leader trying to claim the broken remains of the Dominion. The era of tyranny is over. The galaxy will not be ruled by fear again. Order must be restored not by chains, but by choice. We will not govern you. We will not demand your loyalty. But we will not allow another empire of oppression to rise. Let this be your only warning. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact. The galaxy was free to shape its own future, but humanity would not allow another dominion to rise. The message left the leaders of the surviving species in shock. No demands, no conditions, just a simple truth. The age of conquest was over. If warlords sought to replace the Exeldar with their own empire, they would face the same fate. At first, some factions considered resisting, rejecting the idea that humanity could dictate the fate of the galaxy. But deep down, they knew the truth. It was not humanity's words that held power, it was the terrifying reality of what they could do. The Phantom Singularity was proof that Earth possessed knowledge beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. If humanity had wanted to, they could have wiped out the entire Dominion, taken every world for themselves, and ruled without opposition. And yet, they had chosen not to. That restraint was what truly unnerved the galaxy's leaders. Slowly, the wars that had erupted in the Dominion's wake began to settle. Factions that had once sought to claim power now hesitated, wary of drawing humanity's attention. Instead of one empire replacing another, smaller alliances formed. A new system began to take shape, not through conquest, but through cooperation, born from the simple truth that no one wished to invite Earth's wrath. The new galactic order had no single ruler, no throne from which an emperor dictated the fate of trillions. Instead, it was an uneasy balance, a galaxy held together by the unspoken understanding that humanity was watching. And perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Not through war, not through bloodshed, but through the silent, unshakable knowledge that Earth had become the guardian of the stars.